That afternoon, the Consolidated Trust Bank was no different from any other day. Noisy, predictable, repetitive. The line of customers moved forward steadily, and keyboards clacking echoed in rhythm like the clock ticking. But amid the constant flow, there was one figure who made the air around him seem to pause for a brief moment. Clarence Jordan, 65, wore a neatly pressed but aged shirt and held a faded envelope in one hand. His frame was thin, his back slightly hunched, and his steps slow but steady. He didn't look around and didn't complain about the wait. He was used to waiting. Inside the envelope was a check from the Department of Veterans Affairs, compensation for war-related injuries, something he had waited years to receive. It wasn't much, but to him it meant repairing a decaying roof and maybe buying a train ticket to visit the toddler grandson who had just started walking. At an age when most had long settled into rest, CJ still shouldered his burdens silently. That day, no one at the bank knew he had once been a sergeant, had marched through gunfire, and had used these very hands to save comrades on a distant battlefield. They only saw an old black man with a strange check. CJ didn't know that in just a few more minutes he would step into another battle without bullets, but equally cold and ruthless. And this time he wasn't fighting for his country, but his dignity. At window 4 stood a young woman with neatly tied-back blonde hair. Her name tag on her chest read Amber Lee. She spoke and typed quickly, and her gaze often flicked across customers like she was scanning for system errors. CJ gently laid the check on the counter. "I'd like to deposit this into my account," he said, his voice warm, deep, respectful. Amber glanced at the piece of paper. For a fleeting second, her expression shifted. It was unclear whether it was suspicion, disdain, or simply irritation. "Hold on a minute," she said, looking up. "This check doesn't meet our standards." CJ slowly pulled out his identification and then passed it over. "This is a check from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It has my name and my number. And here's my retired military ID." Amber took the check and held it up to the UV light, examining it as though it were counterfeit. Then, without another word, she turned around and slid the check into the shredder behind the counter. "Wait," CJ stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching out, but it was too late. The hiss of the shredder sliced through the bank's lobby, sharp, high-pitched, merciless. The check was gone. Years of waiting paperwork, phone calls, and hope now reduced to tiny ribbons of paper drifting into the shredder tray. No one spoke. People in line began to turn and look. A few eyes widened in disbelief. As for CJ, he didn't say a word. His face didn't show anger, didn't raise a voice, just a frozen stillness, like someone shot through the heart who hadn't yet realized the pain. Amber turned back, arms folded, as if she had just completed a routine task. "I can't accept questionable checks. Bank policy." CJ looked at her lips pressed tightly together, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "You just destroyed something I waited almost 7 years to receive. You knew it was real. You didn't want to believe it because of who I am." Amber shrugged, eyes fixed on her screen. "I was just doing my job." But sometimes in what people call doing their job, they forget the most critical part, doing right by another human being. CJ remained standing, his arms slowly falling to his side, as if his entire body had lost its weight and purpose. The shredded fragments, once his future, still fluttered in the tray. He turned to Amber, his eyes devoid of anger, filled only with disbelief. "You didn't make a call. You didn't verify. You didn't ask a supervisor. You just looked at me and decided I wasn't worth a second glance." Amber didn't lift her head. "The check had anomalies. The paper wasn't standard. I checked under UV light and there were regional code discrepancies." "But you had my ID. You could have made a call," CJ said, his voice now rough. "Instead of choosing to verify, you chose to destroy." The atmosphere in the bank thickened. Everyone had stopped queuing. A woman in the corner quietly took out her phone and began recording. No one laughed and no one stepped in. The office door behind the counter opened. A man with salt and pepper hair stepped out in a blue suit and slightly crooked red tie. His nameplate read, "Robert Myers, branch manager." "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low but tinged with irritation. Amber quickly recounted the event, her words smooth. As though memorized, the check had an unusual routing number and was not printed on standard paper. "I suspected fraud and destroyed it under security protocol." Myers nodded calmly, turned to CJ, and offered a mechanical smile. "Mr. Jordan, I understand this is upsetting, but I must prioritize financial security in my role. If there's suspicion, my staff can act to mitigate risk." CJ didn't respond right away. He took a deep breath, then pulled out 2 cards, a retired military ID and a valid driver's license with matching names. He handed them to Myers, slowly but firmly. "I'm not a nobody. I served 3 tours overseas. I didn't commit fraud, I didn't steal, and I am certainly not just some suspicious check because of my skin color and age." Myers glanced briefly at the 2 cards, then turned his face away. "Sir," he said, still politely, "if you're dissatisfied, you may file a formal complaint through our dispute resolution process. That is the most appropriate legal channel." CJ stepped back. They never intended to hear him, not out of fear, but because he understood. That day, no one at the bank imagined that a man could fall without collapsing and go silent without being broken. He looked directly at Amber and Myers, his gaze no longer a plea. This isn't over. Inside him something stirred, not rage but pride. And when the pride of a man who has fought is wounded, even the sturdiest walls can tremble. CJ walked out of the bank. The glass doors closed behind him, but they couldn't contain the sting in his chest, a cold insult he'd grown too used to enduring. The bench outside was iron-cold, paint-chipped, facing the busy street. He sat down, sweat soaked the back of his shirt, sunlight slanted across his shoulder, but the heat was nothing compared to the feeling of being erased from his worth. In his hand, he held an old phone. He opened his contacts, scrolling slowly until he paused on a familiar name, N. Ellison, Undersec, not a stranger. Undersecretary for Domestic Finance, Nora Ellison was once a finance officer stationed at the same base as CJ years ago. She knew him. She knew the value of men like him. He stared at the screen. His hands trembled not out of fear, but because he knew that it wouldn't be personal if he made this call. It would be a battle. He pressed call, 1 ring, then a calm, professional female voice. "Office of the Undersecretary for Domestic Finance, how may I help you?" CJ adjusted his voice, though it didn't need much effort. It already carried strength. "This is Sergeant Clarence Jordan, retired. I need to speak directly with Undersecretary Nora Ellison, immediately. This concerns a commercial bank branch's unauthorized destruction of a U.S. Treasury check. I'm sitting just outside that bank." Silence for 3 seconds, then with a click, the line was transferred. No hold music, no robotic voice. Just a breath in and then firm, "CJ. It's me, ma'am." For the first time that day, he felt truly heard. "What happened?" CJ recounted everything, step by step, every detail. From the teller's suspicious glance to the shredder, to the manager's suggestion that he could file a complaint. On the other end, Ellison didn't interrupt. She just listened and breathed short, sharp. Finally, her voice was low, tight as a drawn string. "They shredded it. A Treasury check issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs." "Yes, ma'am." "No verification, none. And you were there with full ID." "I was." She said nothing else. 1 second, then 2. Then her tone shifted, no longer that of the old friend, but of a senior official who knew she now held fire in her hands. "Don't move, CJ. I'm calling a few friends. They'll be there very soon." CJ nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I'll wait." This time he wasn't waiting as someone the world forgot. He was waiting as someone who had awakened the tide. And this time he wasn't alone. CJ sat silently on the bench, phone still in his hand. The evening breeze brushed against his collar, carrying the acrid scent of hot asphalt and car exhaust. But he noticed no smells, heard no sounds, only the waiting taut, as a bowstring ready to snap. Less than 10 minutes after the call, the screech of tires on pavement broke the silence. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, followed by a second. The doors opened swiftly, not rushed, not hesitant, not discreet. 4 individuals in black suits stepped out. There was no need for introductions. Their presence spoke for itself. These were not bank employees. These were federal agents, and they had come to act. CJ didn't stand. He watched, nodding slightly as one of them, a woman, passed by. Her gaze, sharp as a blade, paused on him for half a second. They had identified their man. The bank doors swung open. The murmur inside collided with the cold silence of the agents. Agent Serena Davies led them from the office of the Comptroller of the Currency. Beside her was Agent Marcus Young of the Treasury Inspector General's office. Both flashed their credentials swiftly, decisively, like verdicts. "Mr. Robert Myers, Ms. Amber Lee." Davies's voice rang out each syllable like a blade cutting through the air. "We are conducting an emergency audit of this branch's handling of U.S. Treasury instruments. We are also investigating the unauthorized destruction of a federal check issued to Sergeant Clarence Jordan." The bank lobby froze. Amber stood paralyzed behind the counter. Her face was drained of color, and none of the confidence from earlier remained. Myers emerged from his office, his eyes flicking nervously towards CJ outside. His expression carried only one message: concern and helplessness. "Can you all please tell me what this is?" "No," Agent Marcus interrupted. "We're not asking. We're executing. You'll both accompany us to the internal conference room. This is a formal directive." Amber opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Now in her eyes there was no longer the pride of a banker following protocol, only the stunned realization that protocol does not protect against the law. CJ remained seated silent, but his gaze, sharp as a knife, followed them not with satisfaction, but as a warning. Because in a system that seems untouchable, one resolute individual can still shake its walls. The internal conference room, once used for quarterly reviews, had become an impromptu interrogation chamber. Outside, customers murmured and bank staff stood still as statues. The branch felt like it had stopped breathing. Amber Lee sat hunched in a swivel chair, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes cast downward. Opposite her sat Agent Marcus, who didn't need to raise his voice to make the room feel smaller. "We reviewed the internal footage," Marcus began, expressionless. "There was no verification call, no report to your superior before destruction. You claim you suspected fraud." Amber gave a slight nod. "The check had unusual paper. The routing number didn't match the templates I've seen. And you decided to destroy a federal instrument based solely on intuition." Marcus asked, his voice low but sharp. Amber looked up for the first time, meeting his eyes, but her earlier defiance had faded now, replaced with confusion and fear. I thought I was doing the right thing. I was trained that if there are red flags, I need to react quickly." "Were you trained to doubt, or were you trained to verify before destroying someone's property?" Amber was silent, then exhaled, then nodded. "No, I didn't follow the full protocol. I was too certain. I'm sorry." Agent Marcus watched her for a moment. Not angry, not lenient. "You didn't just suspect wrongly. You acted wrongly, and that nearly destroyed the livelihood of someone who served this country with his life." In the adjacent room, Robert Myers was also being questioned. Agent Davies sat across from him, an open file in front of her. "You're the branch manager. You're responsible for oversight and training. Your system has a secondary verification step in cases like this, correct? Yes, Myers admitted, eyes on the floor. But you chose not to enforce it. Why? Myers swallowed hard. I trusted my employee's judgment. I didn't want to disrupt operations if the issue was false. You didn't want to disrupt the bank, but you were willing to disrupt a man's life, Davies spoke softly. But each word landed like a stone. The room was dead silent. Outside, CJ still sat on the bench. But now he was no longer the one suffering. He was the witness to a system being unmasked. Customers passing by looked at him differently, no longer with pity but with admiration. A middle-aged man placed a hand on CJ's shoulder, no words, just a nod. An older woman pulled out her phone and took a photo of the bank's nameplate. A teenage girl whispered, "Was he a veteran?" And they still treated him like that. And somewhere in that bank power began to shift. No longer held by titles, but by those who dared to demand what's right. About an hour later, as the interrogations neared their end, CJ's phone buzzed inside the pocket of his faded shirt. The screen displayed the caller's name, Ellison, Treasury. He answered. Nora Ellison got straight to the point, no pleasantries. "CJ, I have news for you." Her voice was steady like on the battlefield, not loud but undeniable. "Your check has been reissued via electronic transfer. The funds will reach your account before this bank closes today. Any related fees, including processing errors or delays, have all been waived." CJ said nothing for a moment, perhaps out of relief. Or maybe he wasn't used to someone believing in him and acting that swiftly. But Ellison wasn't finished. "This branch is now under full investigation. Amber Lee is suspended and undergoing review for termination. Branch manager Robert Myers is facing formal reprimand and likely reassignment. I also just received a call from the bank's regional director. He's on his way there, not to explain things to me, but to speak to you." CJ smiled slightly. Not broadly, but it was the first smile of the day. "Thank you, Ma'am," he said hoarsely. "I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking for respect." Ellison replied, "You served this country with honor. The least we can do is ensure this system doesn't treat you like a threat." A few minutes later, a high-end SUV pulled up in front of the bank. The regional director, Chase Brody, hurried inside. His hair was messy, shirt wrinkled, face pale, shiny black shoes speckled with dust. He didn't look at CJ, didn't ask, didn't apologize. He walked straight into the management office like a supporting actor in a film he no longer controlled. CJ remained seated, observing, not smug, not triumphant. Because when justice speaks, the righteous need not shout. CJ's silence now was the silence of someone who had reclaimed his dignity by the strength of his presence. Customers gradually left the bank. However, something had shifted not on paper, but in how they looked at the 65-year-old black man sitting outside in the sun. They no longer saw an old man with a check. They saw a man who stood alone, making the whole system stop and reconsider. The afternoon light began to fade. Sunlight stretched across the sidewalk like soft golden threads. The Consolidated Trust Bank had returned to its daily routine, but not to the cold indifference of that morning. CJ still sat on the old bench, back straight. His hands rested on his lap. No phone in hand, no one was beside him. Inside him, everything was finally quiet. He looked through the glass, where a security officer gently escorted Amber Lee, pale-faced, shoulders heavy. She didn't resist, didn't explain, just walked silently like the wordless end of someone who once believed they were unquestionably correct. CJ didn't feel joy, didn't feel revenge. He only felt what was right. Inside the conference room, Robert Myers had also removed his name badge. He sat in silence off to the side. The chair that once symbolized authority is now reduced to the seat of someone abandoned by the system he upheld. CJ stood up, slowly but firmly, as if he were laying down an old burden made of long-suffering hollow nods and baseless suspicion. He walked away each step, declaring, "I will no longer bow my head." Along the busy street, pedestrians came and went, but a few turned their heads, perhaps recognizing him, the man in the faded shirt who carried an attitude that couldn't be bargained with dignity. In this story, CJ didn't just reclaim a check. He made an entire system stop and take a hard look at itself. He held those who hid behind the word procedure accountable, and he showed those who felt invisible. A brave voice standing firm in silence can shake even the mightiest walls. As he turned the corner, a young woman, one of the bank's earlier customers, ran after him. "Sir, you're a veteran, aren't you?" CJ nodded gently. She placed a hand over her heart. "Thank you for everything, not just for serving the country, but for today." CJ smiled, a smile not laced with victory, just the smile of a man who knew he had won by not losing himself. This story was never just about a shredded check. It was about how a man reclaimed his worth, not through shouting, but through perseverance, honor, and the unwavering belief that he deserved to be respected.